From the hushed hollows of Pennsylvania's wooded hills to the towering shadows of California's ancient redwoods and on to the windswept deserts of Utah, each place holds a secret best glimpsed in the eerie glow of twilight. In these three accounts, everyday explorers stumble upon something beyond the ordinary, a chilling brush with the unknown that leaves them questioning what truly lurks just out of sight. And as the sun sets and darkness settles, one truth remains. There's a fine line between the world we recognize and the mysteries waiting to be discovered. Step into the abyss and welcome to Weird Encounters, a place where the ordinary fades into shadow and the unexplainable comes alive. Make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, and join our ever-growing community of the curious. Your support is the lifeblood that keeps this channel alive. Now, prepare yourself, for what you're about to witness is not for the faint of heart. Isn't it strange how the scenery of rolling hills and quiet woods can change after sundown, turning all that natural beauty into a stage for something unsettling? In the heart of Pennsylvania's Laurel Highlands, under the watchful eye of ancient oaks and winding back roads, one woman's late drive home took a turn from the familiar to the inexplicable, revealing that even the most familiar landscape might hold secrets we'd rather not see. This took place in southwestern Pennsylvania near Ohiopyle State Park, specifically along Route 381. I'm mentioning the exact location because if anyone else has seen what I saw, maybe they'll know they're not alone. Let me set the scene a bit more. It was late October, and the last of the autumn color was hanging on the maples and oaks. The roads here twist and turn, edging steep ravines and dense forest. Daylight in these hills is postcard perfect. Tourists come for the scenic overlooks and the waterfalls. But once that sun dips past the ridges, the shadows in these woods seem to draw closer, and every rustle can send a chill up your spine. I had spent the day at a friend's old cabin off a gravel spur near the Youghiogheny River. We were poking around the barn on the property. He kept talking about odd carvings in the wooden rafters, circles and symbols that didn't look like any old brand marks. Anyway, by the time I left, dusk was settling in. I'd been on Route 381 only 5 minutes when I saw something at the edge of my headlights. A figure I first assumed was a deer stepping out onto the road. I slowed down, expecting it to bolt, but it didn't. Instead, it stood there in a way a deer shouldn't stand, almost too tall at the front shoulders, like it was balancing awkwardly. Its eyes glinted, but not with the usual reflective glare you see from deer. It was more of a soft glow, pointed straight at me. All of a sudden it jerked upright, then dropped down and bolted into the trees with terrifying speed and almost no sound. The silence was the scariest part, as if I just witnessed something that knew how to move without disturbing the leaves or branches. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel my pulse in my ears. I tried telling myself it was just a deer behaving strangely, but I couldn't shake the sense that it was all wrong. When I passed a small cluster of houses near Mill Run, I saw a parked truck with its hazard lights flashing. A man stood next to the vehicle, shining a flashlight into the woods. I rolled down my window an inch and asked if everything was okay. He mentioned seeing some strange creature cross the road a few minutes before I arrived. He didn't call it a deer. He said it looked messed up, like it had extra joints or something. That confirmation from a total stranger made my skin crawl. I eventually reached my cousin's place, still shaken. She shrugged it off, saying there are stories around here about not deer, or deer that aren't quite deer at all, like illusions or something more sinister. She mentioned local rangers once warned her not to wander alone after dark, but they never gave a proper reason. Over the next few days, I got curious and started asking questions whenever I stopped in at the Store Road Market in Normalville. One morning, I asked the cashier if anyone reported weird sightings. A woman in line behind me spoke up quietly, saying she'd seen something similar last year near the outskirts of Forbes State Forest. She recalled that the creature twisted its head around in a way that made her stomach drop. She claimed that when she told the park office, they looked at her like she was crazy. She never brought it up again, but she swears she's never driven that route at night since. I also spoke with a caretaker at Fallingwater, the famous Frank Lloyd Wright house in Mill Run, who said a few staff members refused to stay late in the winter months, claiming they've spotted odd shapes moving in the surrounding woods after dark. He mentioned a rumor that some rangers allegedly removed a carcass that looked malformed, but no official report was ever published. That caretaker claimed to have overheard a conversation where a local official told staff to keep quiet so as not to rile up curious visitors or cause a panic. Whether that's a government cover-up or just small-town hush-hush, I don't know. Then there's the story of a teen who went missing briefly in the area about a decade ago. People said he got lost near an abandoned logging road. He eventually turned up after a frantic search, but he was delirious, babbling about eyes in the dark that belonged to something that seemed like a deer, yet wasn't. Local folks chalked it up to dehydration or fear, but part of me wonders if he stumbled onto the same thing I did. There's a heavy atmosphere here that's hard to describe. Under the towering pines and crooked branches, the forest floor is layered with centuries of fallen leaves. It's the kind of place where you can almost feel the weight of the past. Some folks even whisper about old cult activity hidden in these hills, pointing to cryptic symbols carved on stones near old homesteads. I'm not sure how much of that is urban legend, but combined with these sightings, it adds another layer of unease. I don't know if I'm dealing with a flesh and blood creature, a supernatural anomaly, or something else entirely. All I know is that when you're alone on those winding roads, with only your headlights cutting through the darkness, you start to realize how vulnerable you really are. And sometimes, the world outside that beam of light feels more alive than anything you see in front of you. If anyone else out there has seen something like this, I'd love to hear about it. These hills might be beautiful, but I'm convinced there's more lurking among them than standard wildlife. And so, in the hushed hollows of the Laurel Highlands, a traveler catches a fleeting glimpse of something best left in folklore, except it's standing right there on the roadside. A quiet warning, perhaps, that even the most familiar forest trails can hide creatures we're not prepared to meet when night finally comes calling. They say the towering redwoods in Northern California have stood watch for centuries, guarding secrets that most folks would never dare imagine. Yet every so often, a traveler veers off the beaten path, stumbling into a mystery so unsettling it leaves them questioning just how ordinary these ancient forests really are. I've been going back and forth about sharing what happened to me in the Redwood National Park area this past spring. I can't quite explain it. Even now, it feels like a fever dream. But I keep replaying the events over and over. It's been haunting my nights for too long, so maybe telling the story will help me. I was driving up the Redwood Highway, US 101, heading toward Crescent City, California, in late April of last year. The plan was to spend a few days photographing those massive old-growth trees. Maybe do some kayaking in the Klamath River if time allowed. I wasn't anticipating anything unusual. I'd been there before, and it's always been just that gorgeous, mist-shrouded wilderness. But from the moment I entered the park, something felt off, like the woods were watching me in a way they hadn't before. I pulled into one of the smaller trailhead parking areas around dusk because I thought I could grab some quick photos of the last light hitting the trunks. Almost immediately, I noticed a battered old station wagon parked in the corner. The windows were fogged up, and there was this cold heaviness in the air. No one else was around, so I assumed whoever owned that wagon was off on a trail. I hopped out of my car, camera bag slung over my shoulder. The forest was quiet. No birds, no wind in the canopy, just a sort of damp silence. I remember stepping onto the trail, seeing the ferns brushing against my ankles. After maybe 5 minutes, I noticed this faint smell that reminded me of rotting seaweed, which didn't make sense since I was a good distance from the coast. Then I started hearing these muffled thumps, almost like footsteps but softer. I thought maybe it was just another hiker, so I waited to see if someone emerged. No one did. It was getting dark quickly, and the silence was getting under my skin, so I decided to head back to the car. As I reached the trailhead, I saw a figure standing near that station wagon. Could have been a man, but it was too dim to tell. He, or it, had a hood up or something covering the head and was stooped looking into the open driver's side door. I called out a quick greeting, but got no response. Just a glance in my direction. I couldn't see a face, just shadow. Then, in a strangely stiff movement, the figure shut the door without making a sound and walked off into the woods, leaving the wagon behind. That was enough for me. I got in my car, locked the doors, and drove straight to Crescent City, where I was staying. The next day, I went to the visitor center to ask about any strange activity in the park, maybe break the ice by saying I saw a suspicious person. The ranger on duty didn't say much, just that the redwood forests attract all sorts of travelers and researchers, some with unusual habits. I pressed a bit more, and he mentioned that occasionally park staff encounter sites in the woods where small fires have been lit and odd symbols carved into fallen logs. He advised me to stay on the main trails. That night, things got weirder. I was in Crescent City near the harbor, grabbing a late bite. I struck up a conversation with a local who claimed the government did biological surveys in the redwoods back in the 1970s. He mumbled something about odd sightings, people going missing, rumors of cult gatherings deep in the forest, possibly connected to old logging roads. He said half of it is probably just small-town myth. But he also mentioned a retired forestry worker who supposedly saw unidentifiable figures in camouflage near Redwood Creek after dark, carrying strange equipment that didn't look like standard Forest Service gear. The next day, I tried to track down that retired forestry worker, but the lead went nowhere. No one at the local diner or gas station seemed to know him, or they pretended not to. I decided to continue with my photography plans, though, focusing on Prairie Creek Redwoods State Park. The giant trees were mesmerizing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me from just out of sight. Maybe it was my nerves from the previous night, or maybe it was the absolute hush that seemed to follow me. Late that afternoon, near the Fern Canyon area, I stumbled upon a small clearing that seemed well-traveled, despite being off-trail. The ground had been cleared of ferns, and in the center, there was a circle of rocks that looked almost ceremonial. I saw black, charred remains in the middle, maybe a burnt offering or something. The strangest part was a series of twisted branches lodged upright in the ground around the circle. My first instinct was that it might be some leftover campfire site, but the arrangement was too deliberate. It spooked me enough that I snapped a few photos before hurrying out of there. Later, I tried to tell a park employee at Prairie Creek Visitor Center about what I found. He gave me a concerned look but didn't press for details. He mentioned that if it looked like a possible cult site or something illegal, I could notify the local sheriff's office. He didn't seem surprised, though, almost as if these stories weren't unheard of. That evening, back in Crescent City, I ran into a couple who said they'd also been exploring near Fern Canyon. They looked rattled when I brought up the clearing. The woman said they heard chanting, though she admitted it could have been the wind or water echoes. The man recalled a faint glow that flickered among the trees, as if someone was carrying a lantern, but they never saw a person. They ended up hightailing it out of there, not wanting to find out who or what was lurking in the fog. The next morning was my last day, and I decided to drive out before sunrise to get some dramatic shots of the mist among the redwoods. The roads were nearly empty. Somewhere near the junction with Bald Hills Road, I spotted what looked like an official SUV pulled off on the shoulder. No visible markings, tinted windows. I slowed down, thinking maybe it was a ranger or highway patrol, but there were no license plates. Just as I passed, someone inside turned on a flashlight, briefly illuminating the inside. I caught a glimpse of a figure wearing a dark uniform that didn't look like standard park ranger attire. It gave me that gut feeling that I should just keep moving. I left that day feeling uneasy, like I'd only scratched the surface of something bigger, maybe some hidden group out in the woods, or a hush-hush government operation overshadowed by the grandeur of the redwoods. There's a mood in those forests after dark that's impossible to describe unless you've felt it yourself. It's as though the trees are holding on to old secrets, quietly watching you pass by. And sometimes you get the sense you're not meant to be there at all. Anyway, I'm sending this because I need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone else has had a similar experience in Redwood National Park or glimpsed those weird gatherings among the towering trunks. All I know is I'll never see that stretch of forest the same way again. I might have walked straight into something I was never supposed to see. Sometimes, the desert sun bakes secrets right into the cracked earth, leaving behind murmurs and flickers that dance on the horizon. Far from the neon lights of city life, in the vast stillness of Utah's remote West Desert, one traveler found that silence can hold far more than echoes of the wind. I took a trip out to the Utah West Desert to explore around the Dugway Range, not too far from the Dugway Proving Ground. I'm an amateur photographer with a fascination for the stark beauty of salt flats and desert vistas, so I was hoping to catch some dramatic shots at sunset. I'd been on the road for a few hours coming in from Salt Lake City, and the drive was mostly uneventful. A flat stretch of highway with towering mountains in the distance. The temperature outside was scorching, near 100 degrees, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. Late in the afternoon, I passed a sign for Fish Springs National Wildlife Refuge, decided to make a quick detour just to see if there were any interesting birds or wildlife. I had no clue, at the time, that it would lead me down a path I still can't fully explain. On my way out of Fish Springs, I noticed a battered sign pointing to an old mining town called Gold Hill. I'd heard vaguely about this place, something about old tungsten mines, a bit of a ghost town these days. I felt a spark of curiosity. As I drove that lonely dirt road, I kept getting the feeling that someone was watching from just over a ridge or behind the scattered sagebrush. I shrugged it off as paranoia. The sun was starting its descent by then, bathing everything in an orange glow. Things got strange when I pulled off near a dry creek bed to snap some photos of the sun going down over the mountains. The air was so still, I could hear my own breathing. As I set up my tripod, I heard a low hum, like distant machinery. No vehicles were around, so I figured maybe it was just the wind cutting through the canyons. But the hum had this steady, rhythmic pulse to it that I could almost feel in my chest. It faded after a minute or so, leaving the desert silent again. Just as the last rays of the sun disappeared, I glimpsed movement on a nearby hill, a glint of something reflective. I grabbed my binoculars, scanning the hillside. There was a dark shape that looked like a large vehicle, maybe an SUV, perched way up there, almost hidden among the rocks. No headlights, no sign of a campsite. I couldn't make out any details, but it felt unsettling, like I was being watched. I decided it was time to head back. I drove toward Dugway Proving Ground on a route I'd researched was public, but the signage can be confusing. Lots of warnings about authorized personnel only, testing ranges, that sort of thing. Eventually, I saw another sign telling me to turn around if I didn't have clearance. I was about to do just that when a black SUV with tinted windows pulled onto the road from a side path. It slowed down as it passed me, and I glimpsed a man in the driver's seat wearing what looked like a plain black baseball cap. No identifiable insignia. I waved, but he didn't acknowledge me. Something about that encounter left me jittery. I decided to make my way back to the main highway and find a place to camp overnight. The closest semblance of civilization was a motel in Wendover. I arrived late, got a cheap room, and tried to sleep. I couldn't. I kept hearing that hum in my head. The next morning, over a hasty breakfast at a local diner, I mentioned the weird hum and the SUV to the waitress. She gave me an odd look and said, "Folks around there see unmarked vehicles more often than you'd think." Then she quietly mentioned that she once had a relative who worked on the perimeter security of Dugway Proving Ground, a restricted site involving who knows what, where weird lights were sometimes spotted in the sky at night. She said if I was smart, I'd stick to the main roads and not linger near the boundaries. Later that day, I returned to the desert, hoping to photograph some geological features. When I parked near a rocky outcrop, I noticed something stuck in the dry, cracked ground, a tiny piece of metal with holes in it, almost like a vented cap. I picked it up, thinking maybe it was debris from old testing or mining equipment. It looked too modern to be from the old Gold Hill days. I pocketed it, but the second I did, I got that prickly sensation on the back of my neck again. I set up to take photos of the swirling dust devils in the distance. While adjusting my zoom lens, I spotted a cluster of large black birds circling overhead. Crows, maybe ravens. Then, behind them, way higher in the sky, a gleam of silver flicked in and out of the sunlight. At first, I assumed it was just a plane, but it hovered unnaturally for a few seconds, then shot off at an impossible angle, vanishing almost instantly. I stood there, mouth agape, camera still clutched in my hands. I know the desert can mess with your sense of distance and perspective, but I've seen plenty of planes, and that was no typical aircraft. When I got back to my car, my phone had no signal, which wasn't unusual out there, but the screen was acting strangely, lines flickering, battery percentage fluctuating. For a moment, I thought my phone was dying from the heat, but it felt more like interference. I drove around for another hour looking for a better vantage point, eventually pulling over near an area known as Skull Valley. Lovely name, right? That's when I spotted fresh tire tracks in the dirt that matched a large SUV heading off-road into a restricted zone. No signage indicated a public trail, so it had to be someone who knew the area or had clearance. By this point, I'd had enough. My curiosity was overshadowed by a growing sense of unease, like I'd stumbled onto something that wasn't meant for me to see. I made it back to Wendover late that night. The next morning, while gassing up, I overheard two men in line talking about strange booms heard out near Dugway. One mentioned a rumor that a local rancher saw lights dancing over his fields, followed by a black helicopter that scared his livestock. On my final day, I returned home to Salt Lake City, and that should have been the end of it. But about a week later, I got a call from an unknown number. I answered out of habit. A voice asked if I'd been in the restricted area recently, then hung up before I could respond. It could have been a prank, but it left my heart racing. Even now, I keep thinking about that hum, that unmarked SUV, and the shimmering craft in the sky. I know places like Dugway Proving Ground are rumored to be another Area 51, with all sorts of hush-hush military testing. But there's a difference between reading about these rumors and actually experiencing something that makes you question just how far the rabbit hole goes. I haven't even shown anyone the weird metal piece I found. It's sitting in a drawer in my office, and occasionally I think about sending it for analysis. But then I get a chill, like I might be poking a hornet's nest. Maybe there's a perfectly logical explanation for everything. But after that trip, I can't shake the feeling that something bigger is going on in those desert expanses. Something the average person isn't supposed to witness. My dear watchers, your presence is a gift. Thank you for your time, your curiosity, your courage. But remember, there are others who wander, unaware of the dangers that await. By liking this video and subscribing, you offer them a light in the darkness. Support our channel and keep the stories coming, simply by giving a thumbs up and subscribing and sharing.